Well, good evening everyone. You're all very welcome here to St. Mary's and to this, our first Lenten talk for 2021. Usually we're in the hall and there's a group of people and you're all there seated in rows in front of me and it's easier. Now I'm focusing on this camera and I have the wall. I'm here in the Lady Chapel, Our Lady's above me there, and St. Joseph has been moved out of the way so he's not in the shot. But we'll bring him in for the talk in 2 weeks' time when we're going to be talking about St. Joseph. But tonight we want to reflect on humanity, and I put a few words onto the wall because of course it's difficult to read in this context, and when I move around I notice that in practicing this that the contrast between the dark that I have, the light coloured wall and the colours up there sometimes makes everything change. So apologies for the quality, but it's because I don't have a sophisticated camera, I just have my phone. But I just wanted to talk about the whole issue of who we are, because it's a real issue that goes through a whole lot of subjects in society today, in our Western world, in Scotland, the United Kingdom, in the European Union, the United States. Just the Western world is just at odds with itself about what does it mean to be human? What is a human? You know, and if I slip into using the language of what is man, I'm sorry, I apologise for that, but we're talking about humanity itself. And it's just to give us some thoughts. There's no answers here, but I'm going to present some ideas, some thoughts, just to make us think and realise that when we hear debates going on or when we're involved in discussions with people, the language we use sometimes is important because the language expresses the ideas that lie behind what it is we are trying to say. And of course, the difficulty for debate is if you have one set of understanding of what you mean to be a person and what I have. It's the difficulty in a whole lot of debates today about human sexuality, about the beginning of life, about the end of life. And that's what I want to talk about this evening. Not those subjects as such, but the ideas that underlie all those subjects and why it is that quite often we in the church find ourselves at odds with the way in which the world is going today and the way in which it thinks. So anyway, today's the 4th of March. And I just wonder if you know what happened on the 4th of March, 1962, 59 years ago today. Well, I'll give you a clue. There we go. Lovely picture. It was a Sunday. And that's my father, and that's me, and that's my mother, and that's Snowy, who was the dog at the time. And that's my christening. 59 years ago today I was baptised. So everything that's happened to me in my life, including standing here in front of you now, flows from that moment. John Paul II said that about his baptism, that everything else flowed from the fact that he was born into Christ on the day of his baptism. I was baptised within 4 weeks of being born. And that's 59 years ago today, I was baptised. Now, the reason for showing this is that, I don't know if you're like me, but you know in the morning, if you're waking up early or at night before you go to sleep, you might be looking on your phone or on your iPad or your tablet or whatever. And quite often I find myself watching these daft little films on YouTube, on Facebook, which sometimes feature families with pets. And one of my favourite ones is the way in which dogs, even cats, but dogs particularly, their relationship with newborn infants, like Snowy and me there. The relationship between them. And the way in which people speak about them. Because that's the really interesting thing. The images are lovely. You know, when you see the dog sniffing at this baby when it arrives home. And then quite often people have taken pictures the first week, the first month, 6 months, the year, or they've been filming it. And it just shows you the growing relationship between that child and that animal. But it's interesting in that quite often people say, and imagine, let's just use my mum and dad and me. Here's Mary and Tommy bringing baby Thomas in to meet his big brother Snowy. Now, my parents would never have said that Snowy was my big brother. No doubt they would have been concerned, like parents are today, if they have a pet, particularly a dog or a cat, at home and there's a baby coming for the first time, a new baby, it's the first child. How will that pet react? Because of course he or she has been the focus of attention. It's like an only child suddenly has a brother or sister. Well, that never happened to me. I remained an only child all of my life. But there's always that apprehension about, especially because dogs are dogs. We know that they can be dangerous sometimes, that they can nip, and that terrible things have happened sometimes to children, not necessarily to newborn infants, but to toddlers running around when dogs get excited and awful things can happen. And so there's that kind of apprehension. But in those days, 59 years ago, as I said, my parents would never have said, we're introducing Thomas to his big brother Snowy, or Snowy is meeting his little brother. They wouldn't use that language, because there would have been no question whatsoever that Snowy was a pet, was a dog. Part of the family, yes, but not in any sense, in language or in fact, a child. A member of the family in the same way as I became on the day I was born, the 8th of February 1962. And one of the interesting things that, if you watch those films, and when the child gets to walk and when they're out playing, and then it can be a very big dog, and the child is leading the dog. It's a toddler, and he's leading the dog on a walk. And still, they are best friends. You hear them, the commentary. They're best friends. The two brothers like to walk together. But that's not what's happening, of course. Because here's me and Snowy, probably within 18 months, 2 years after my baptism. That's out the back in Saltcoats. My grandparents had a room and kitchen in Saltcoats where we used to go at the weekend. And there's me and Snowy. And there's no question there of what the relationship is in that image. No question at all. Because that dog is dependent on me. Because I'm feeding it. I'm giving it something to eat. And when you look at those YouTube or Facebook films and the child is leading the big dog on a leash, that expresses the relationship. The superior is that little toddler. There's no doubt about that. And the dog knows it. The dog doesn't lead the child. The child leads the dog. Oh, you even see the dog stopping when the child stops. And I'm just using this as an example in the way in which language is used today can confuse the reality of what our relationship is with animals. In this instance, a pet dog. And I'm not against pets. I love dogs. I've thought a few times about having a dog, especially when I lived on my own before I came here to St. Mary's. And there are a number of reasons why I decided not to have a pet. Usually because, I can be away a lot. More so than when I came here to St. Mary's, when I did other jobs and I was quite often away for days at a time. But I couldn't do the plastic bag thing. I just couldn't do that. No, couldn't clean up after a dog like that. No, just couldn't do that, sorry. But I'm not a person who dislikes animals. I think animals should be treated fairly, should be treated properly, should be well looked after, should not be treated cruelly. But they're dogs. They're not human. They're not the same as me. They're not in the same category as my friend's children. My friend's dog is not in the same category as my friend's son or daughter. But the danger is in using language, what we're expressing is the confusion that's arising about the relationship of humanity with animals today. And so, for example, in church documents, you will never find anything but this phrase used about the human, about you and me, men and women, children and adults, the human person. We are people, we are persons. We're not human beings, we are persons. And persons, people have rights. And the law in the Western world has always reflected that. Only people can have rights. Nothing else has rights. And so, for example, as well as human persons, there are juridical persons. This parish, St. Mary's in Greenock, is a juridical person in canon law, which means it can own property. It can own things. It has its own bank account. You know, I might be the person that administers that. I'm the administrator in law of the parish, but the parish is a standalone entity. It doesn't cease when the parish priest changes. It's a juridical person because it has to be described as a person so that it can do the things that people can do, like hold bank accounts and own property and all those sorts of things, because rights adhere to people, not to anything else. And so a limited company, for example, is a juridical person. It's given personality, personage. And that idea is all through the law you find in Western society. There's no question about that. That rights adhere to people, to persons. And sometimes, as I said, groups or entities are given personality so that they can do the things that individuals can do, or families can do, groups of people can do, like own things and have money and bank accounts and things like that, which parishes need. We need to be a personality to survive, to do all the things that you need to do, like pay bills, you know, or own the church itself. I don't own the church. Thomas Boyle does not own this church. As parish priest of this parish, I administer this church. But St. Mary's parish owns this church. And the trustees of the Diocese of Paisley give civil effect to that in Scots law. But in canon law, the property of this parish belongs to the parish, which is a juridical person. So, it's important when there is debate about animal rights, for example, that in itself, what you're saying in is, do animals have the same rights as humans? Are they persons? And to avoid that difficulty, one of the things that animal rights campaigners have been campaigning for is law that protects sentient beings. Now notice the word being. I said we are not human beings, we are human persons. In no church document you find the phrase, or I'd be surprised if you found it somewhere. It may have slipped through some way, maybe in a translation, a mistranslation. But we are human persons, not human beings. Because this phrase, sentient beings, covers the whole idea of consciousness. And of course, animals have consciousness. You know, there's Snowy. He knew who I was. He related to me, to my mum, to my dad, probably to my grandparents, my aunts and uncles who were there at the time. He knew them all. In that sense, he has, you know, a consciousness. But he doesn't have human rights. And so, this idea of sentient beings, if you look at the RSPCA website, you'll see that one of the campaigns that they're involved in is to change the law in the United Kingdom so that sentient beings are recognised. Now, if that becomes law in this country, which it never has been part of the law, it will be a fundamental change of how we talk about life. Because, of course, humans have life, animals have life. But humans are persons. And so there's a distinction. And that distinction comes from our Judeo-Christian background. That's not an accident that the law in this country, and in most Western countries, reflects that. Because, of course, much civil law grew out of church law, of canon law. out of the Bible itself, out of our inheritance, our heritage as who we are as people. But this campaign to make sentient beings protected, be given rights, would be a change in the way in which law understands life itself. And it has implications. I think it was about 20 years ago I said to a friend, what are you reading at the moment? Because it was before the internet was big and we all stopped reading books and newspapers. I'm quite neglectful now because of, at night, looking at YouTube or Facebook rather than reading my book before I go to sleep. And he said, I'm reading, and this was The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night Time. I says, what's it about? He says, it's about a dog that gets murdered. And I said, that's not possible. He says, what do you mean? I said, humans can get murdered. Murder's a crime against human life. Dog might be killed, might be cruelly treated to the point where it dies. It might be cruelly treated as in it is killed by somebody, but it isn't murdered. Murder is a crime against the person. And not in Scots law, but in English law and in Irish law, this is the foundational law about murder and assault and all the things that can be done against the person. The Offences Against the Person Act 1861 is the law under which people are charged with murder, manslaughter, and it applies in Ireland because, of course, 1861, the Parliament of the United Kingdom covered all of these islands. And so, for example, in 1967, the Abortion Act amends this act because this act describes abortion as an offence against the person. To procure an abortion, to have the tools that cause an abortion, or to procure, to effect an abortion, is an offence under the Offences Against the Person Act 1861. And of course, it's not against the person who is the mother, but it's against the person who is in the womb. And sometimes I've been in debates where I've said to people, abortion is still illegal in this country. No, it's not. No, it's not. We've got an Abortion Act. And you have to point out to them, yes, and that Abortion Act allows abortion in certain circumstances. Now, we all know that those circumstances are abused completely, so it's almost like abortion by choice today. That was not the intention of the law at the start in 1967, and it's not the wording of the law. Abortion is still a criminal offence in this country, according to that, and to Scots law, the appropriate Scots law. But in England and Ireland, it's still an abortion. Abortion is still a criminal offence because of this act. And as you see, it is an offence against the person. And for countries with constitutions, like for the United States, the United Kingdom doesn't have a constitution. The definition of what a person is has become a great point of debate. When does personality begin? This act believes it begins in the womb. And so, for example, if you're a dangerous driver and you cause the death of a woman who is pregnant, then you'll be charged not just with her death, but with the death of the child in the womb. It's an offence against the person. And for those countries that do debate abortion as a right, and that's one of the campaigns that goes on as well, is this idea of we need to establish a right to abortion. This law would need to be fundamentally changed in England and in Ireland. Instead of just having the particular act that we have at the moment that permits abortion in certain circumstances. The same exists in Ireland now since they had the referendum. But the person in the womb, in English law and in Irish law, is a person. And there are relevant laws in Scotland as well. This is the best example because it's all summed up. And murder and manslaughter and assault and all those things are in the one act with abortion. Because of the personhood of the person in the womb as well as the person who carries the child in her womb. And that's the importance. That's why I wanted to talk about this evening. It's the importance of how we use language. Because we are not beings, we are persons. And the law in these lands, these islands, have always recognised that. That our rights are ours because we are persons. And that comes from, as I said, our Judeo-Christian background. And so, when we look at the Catechism of the Church, the section on humanity is actually at the beginning of the Creed. I believe in God the Father, creator of heaven and earth, because it then talks about creation and about humanity being the high point of that creation. And what does it say? Well, just quickly, 4 things. We're made in the image of God. Human nature unites the spiritual and material world. We are unique in that. We know there is debate and argument about today about the consciousness of animals, and I mentioned that previously, about how sentient they are, how conscious they are. And I mean, if you go to a zoo and look in the eyes of an orangutan or a gorilla or a chimpanzee, you see something looking back at you. You see a personality in some sense. But that's a separate question. That's for another day. But the uniqueness of humanity is that we know that we know. We are self-conscious. And being self-conscious, we can relate to God. We can relate to the one who created us. We don't just have consciousness, we have self-consciousness. You know. Some animals never understand what a mirror is. Never. When they encounter one, you know, sometimes you see on the internet film of a tiger or a lion, they put a mirror in the jungle somewhere and they come across it and they attack it because they think it's another animal, another of their own species, but they attack it because that's what they're doing, because this animal is invading their space. They don't have that self-consciousness. It's not just like a child that's for the first time seeing a mirror and not knowing that that's me, but it's that they're not capable of understanding, oh, that's me, because they don't have the self-consciousness that we have, because they're not persons. And then, of course, male and female, he created them. Now, I'm not going into this, we could be here all night. But this whole notion of who we are as human beings, human persons, what we are as a person, you know, what does this mean today? When so many people seem to be confused about what it means. In my previous parish, I remember one Sunday after Mass, we were sitting in the hall having a cup of tea, and somebody says, oh, so-and-so had their baby, and someone says, oh, what is it? And nobody seemed to know, and jokingly I said, it'll tell us itself someday. Because, of course, that whole gender debate that's out there at the moment is at the very heart of who we are as a person. You picked up a baby with the heels when it was born, you looked at it and you said, oh, that's a boy, oh, that's a girl. But nowadays, that doesn't seem to be sufficient. It doesn't satisfy some people. There was a friend of mine who's a doctor, who's now a priest, always says, you can't change your chromosomes. You can have as many operations as you want, as much therapy as you want, but in the end, the chromosome says male, female. And that's all through the whole of creation. So, big questions there. But it comes back to this, the use of language and how we understand ourselves and who we are as a person. And then finally, God established him, that's the language the Catechism uses, in friendship. And this is the whole story, of course, of creation, fall, redemption, which is much more theological, but that applies to who we are, the whole mystery of human iniquity, human weakness. of our capability of doing great things, has been proved in human history, and our capability of doing awful things, as is proved by human history. The idea of the fall. Back to that, St. Paul. Why does it I find myself doing the things I don't want to do and unable to do the things I want to do? The mystery of humanity and its imperfection, which of course in Christian theology is about created in God's image and likeness, fallen but redeemed in Jesus Christ. And that's about our relationship with God. God established him, you and I, male and female, in friendship. He relates to us. And so that's the church's perspective on what a human person is. And then, of course, as I said earlier, rights adhere to people, to individuals, to persons. A person has rights. And the Catechism in number 1930 says, respect for the human person entails respect for the rights that flow from his dignity. Our dignity comes from being created in God's image and likeness. Our rights come from the fact that we are persons. The American Constitution describes them as inalienable rights. That is, you can't give them away. They can't be taken from you and you can't give them away. Sometimes it happens, like there's something that needs done here in the church or in the hall or something like that. Excuse me. And someone will say, I'll go up that ladder, Father, and I'll say, no, I'll get somebody to do that. As in, pay a professional to come and do that who has the proper equipment and is insured and all that. No, it's okay, Father, I've had this conversation with people before. It's okay, Father, I'll go up that ladder. And I said, no, you can't do that. No. It's okay, Father, I'll sign a letter saying that, I'll take responsibility for my own actions. You can't give away your rights. You can't say, if I fall off this ladder, which you've let me go up, which you own, I won't be able to sue you for neglect. You can't do that. Just can't be done. And shouldn't be done. Because people will be coerced in that way to sign off their rights. And so, for example, if you see a sign on a piece of property or a piece of land that says, you enter here at your own risk, you actually don't. That means nothing in law. You might enter there at your own risk in that it's telling you it's a dangerous place to enter. But if I'm the owner of that building and I've left it in such a way that you can get into it even though it's dangerous, that's my responsibility. You have rights to be protected. If I knew that one of the pillars here in the church or one of the cross beams above there in the ceiling was in danger of coming down and I let you in and it came down and injured you, or if I told you there was a danger that you can come in but there's a danger, oh, that's okay, Father, I'm still responsible. You can't give away your rights. You can't say, I won't do that. Because, of course, it won't be you. It'll be your spouse or your children. They'll be looking to vindicate your rights after you've died because I let you go up that ladder or I let you sit under that crossbeam that was going to fall on your head. Rights come from who we are as people, and they can't be taken away. And they're the same for everyone. And that's the danger with, for example, the working conditions in the developing world that produces the tea and the coffee that we eat and drink, or that produces the cheap clothes that are sold in shops in this country. It's not an accident that we have very strict laws about children being employed and about protecting the rights of workers for safety, because they have that right to be protected. But in developing nations where their law is not quite as worked out or as evolved as ours is, and remember, 150 years ago, we didn't have these rights either, or these protections in law for workers and for children. And many developing nations don't have those things, that they get exploited. But just because they don't have protection for their rights doesn't mean they don't have the rights. They have the same rights as you and I do, because they're people, they're persons. And that's one of the things that our Holy Father, Pope Francis, has been very keen on in emphasising and protecting the dignity of refugees, of people in the developing world, of what he calls people on the margins of our society. Because, of course, there are people in our society whose rights are not properly vindicated or protected. And, of course, the unborn comes into that. And then, of course, as well, the idea at the end of life. You know, because there's this push to change or to add rights. The right to choose. Or I noticed in the United States, in the debates during their presidential election, it's called reproductive rights now. And what that means is, you know, I think the only reproductive right we have is to be born. Of course, to be safe in pregnancy for the woman. But what that means is a right to abortion, reproductive rights. And there's been a push to include that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations, which has been resisted so far, thankfully. But good organisations, or organisations that started out from a Catholic perspective, like Amnesty International, have turned into that, tuned into that, promoting abortion rights. And if you listen on radio and television, the news uses that language quite freely. Abortion rights. And then, of course, that idea of the right to die. Well, we don't have a right to die. We've got an eventuality that we will die. But what they mean is a right to end my life, or a right to end somebody else's life. It's not a right to die. Because we all have that, because it's a fact. We will die. But do I have the right to take my life? Suicide is in an offence in the Offences Against the Person Act. Because you're violating your own personhood. Now, we know that people in those circumstances are terribly, distraught and all over the place. It's not a criminal offence as such, but the law is there to prevent people from entering into that lightly. But there are those that want to establish this right to die. But it's not a right to die, it's a right to kill myself, a right to kill someone else. And then what that gives is you and I the ability to choose to end life. And of course, it's okay in a sense that I choose to end mine. But when I have to make a decision about a vulnerable person who isn't capable of deciding, then I've acquired their rights. And the most precious of all the rights is the right to life. And at the French Revolution, there was this great emphasis on the rights of man, which of course is the first assertion of that in any kind of legal sense was the Declaration of the Rights of Man, as it was written in French and translated into English like that. And the three great cries are liberty, equality, fraternity. And our Holy Father Pope Francis takes that up in his most recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, which was written just in October last year, and is a reflection on the world as it is in the light of the pandemic and the circumstances that we were living in then and we continue to live in at the moment. And he says that fraternity is the way in which we properly establish liberty and equality. We don't establish it by campaigning. Yes, we do, but only when we have proper sympathy for the people that we're campaigning for. It's not a political thing. It's a human rights thing. It's about the people. It's about persons. And so he says that, I'll read this to you. It is my desire that in this our time, by acknowledging the dignity of each human person, we can contribute to the rebirth of a universal aspiration to fraternity, brotherhood, sisterhood. Fraternity between all men and women. Let us dream then as a single human family, as fellow travellers sharing the same flesh, as children of the same earth, which is our common home, each of us bringing the richness of his or her beliefs and convictions, each of us with his or her own voice, brothers and sisters all. That the best way to protect liberty and equality is to ensure that the rights of each person are protected. And the way in which we do that is by growing in relationship to each other, by fraternity, and by there not being any distinction between peoples or among peoples. And that's how we build a world of equality, of freedom, of rights, because we recognise the dignity of each person, each human person on the face of the earth. And that's why the Pope's going to Iraq. I think tomorrow, or maybe even this evening, I'm not sure exactly. But he's going to be there for 3 or 4 days. And one of the things he's going to do is going to go to Ur and Chaldea, down in the midst of Iraq, where Abraham was from. And he's going to meet with one of the grand ayatollahs of the Shiite branch of Islam. A momentous point in religious relationship, but emphasising the exact dignity of all those who profess whatever form of Islam or religion or none in the world. The unity is brothers and sisters all. Of course, from our perspective, made in the image and likeness of God. From religious people's perspective, ourselves, Judaism, Islam, that same idea, which of course is about 60% of the world's population, come from that perspective. But it's important that we don't, in the discussions and the debates that go on in our own countries about rights and about what it means to be a person or a human today, that we don't lose sight of the basic fundamentals, which is personhood. That you are a person and you deserve my respect because you are made in God's image and likeness. And I'm a person who demands and deserves your respect for the same reason. And that's what creates equality. And it's what creates liberty, because we respect each other's rights. And therefore, we are free. I don't bind you, you don't bind me. We can freely choose to follow a particular religion, a particular philosophy of life or politics or whatever, career, freely chosen. But the reason that we are able to exist in that, with that freedom, is because we respect one another. We have fraternity for the personhood of who you are and who I am. Thanks very much. Good night.